Welcome back. Our next speaker is Anthony Sweat. He's an associate teaching professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. He earned a BFA in painting and drawing from the University of Utah, ME and PhD in curriculum and instruction from Utah State University. And with that short intro, we'll turn the time over to Anthony Sweat.
Well, I'm really grateful to be with each of you today and to be able to share this insight about what I want to speak on. If you can bring it up, if we have the presentation. I'm going to speak on history and art, mediating the Rocky relationship. I purposely did not call this presentation Solving the Rocky Relationship, because it will not be solved. I'll just say that. This is a question that's been being talked about and discussed for a very long time that I don't pretend like I can solve in the next 40 minutes. But what I do hope I can do is provide some insights for you, whether you tend to lean in the artist camp or the history camp, the scholarly camp, about trying to understand why there's some tension and trying to resolve the tension a little bit with it. Just so you know a little bit about my background, my original plans were to be a full-time painter. I have a BFA in painting and drawing from the University of Utah, and I joke that I wanted to be a full-time artist. I wanted to be Walter Rain and Caitlin Conley and Brian Kershiznik and Kirk Richards and artists like that who I greatly admire and I consider friends. But I joke that God saved me from a life of poverty and led me into the big money of religious education instead. So I went on to get a PhD in curriculum and instruction and how do we apply educational theories to religious education. But I haven't lost my love for art, nor my practice of art. As a matter of fact, they've kind of come together. Here's a little bit of my student work. What I've become more known for is not only do I research how art influences how we learn church history and church doctrine, but I've also incorporated both my role as a teacher of church history and doctrine, a scholar of it, and also an artist. For the last 7 years, I've engaged in a project trying to depict scenes from church history that are really important, that are often either undepicted or underdepicted. This is one of my images that I did about 7 years ago, right as I did it for a book called From Darkness Unto Light, about the translation and publication of the Book of Mormon. And this image has gotten a lot of play being passed around, and I want to try to give a faithful rendition that wasn't pejorative of the Book of Mormon translation of Joseph using the seer stone and the hat, or images like this, such as the ordination of Q. Walker Lewis, one of the black men ordained to the priesthood during the 1840s, during Joseph Smith's lifetime. Not all of my images are mantelpiece images. I like to paint things that are even uncomfortable. President Kimball, in his classic talk on the gospel vision of the arts, said that we should also paint and portray the difficulties, the apostasies, the arguments. And so this is literally an argument. I wanted to do a painting of when Joseph Smith brought home the revelation we know as the revelation on eternal and plural marriage in section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. I want to do an image of the difficulties, trying to express the difficulties that showed in Joseph and Emma's marriage. Or this is a recent painting I did, for many who don't know, which I'm sure many in this audience do. For 100 years, our women in our church practiced healing blessings of faith. And we didn't have any imagery of that, or much imagery. There's a few that are out there. but I wanted to try to give an image to show that wonderful part of our history, showing women of faith. So those are the kind of images that I do and the kind of things that I'm interested in as a whole. Now, one of the things as I paint history, people say things like, oh, I love your images because they're so historically accurate. I want to be the first to say, no, they're not. They're not historically accurate. They're historically accurate in substance, but not always in style and not always in detail. And I'll talk about why that may be the case and why that's the case for many other artists as well. But before I do, I want to establish the premise that there are tensions, necessary tensions. And as human beings, we always want to resolve tensions. We want to get rid of the tensions. Let me just give you my thesis up front. Let's not resolve this tension. Let's not try to get rid of it. In business, there's tensions like growth and agility. Do we want our business to get big? Yes. Do we want to be more profitable? Yes. How do we stay agile and flexible? That's a tension for everybody out there who runs a business. They know about that. Or maybe in Christian history, grace and works. How long has this tension been being discussed and tried to be settled, and literally blood spilled over this tension? Even within our own faith, we're still trying to reconcile or understand this tension. In our own faith tradition, more in particular, don't you think it's always a little interesting that we are a church that says that you can receive personal revelation and you have your agency, and yet we are a hierarchical, authoritative church as well? How do you balance the tension of agency and authority? You're never going to resolve it, but we do try to understand it. And in this case, art and history. I want to talk about that tension because I think the better we can understand why the tension exists, we can better understand how to use the tension for our good. That's my goal. Terrell Givens likes to call this, he doesn't use the word tension as much as he uses the word paradox in his book and articles he's written about people of paradox. He says, quote, "Paradox is the sign of a healthy universe," or maybe I would say tension is the sign of a healthy universe. Voracious enough to insist on having its cake and eating it too. Paradox is a sign of richness and plenitude. Those not intellectually adventuresome enough to embrace such paradox find easy refuge to falling to one side or the other of the tightrope. So for any who may be watching or listening to this, can I invite you to not fall to one side or the other of the tightrope? Don't immediately jump. I would assume, based on this audience, most people are going to be more interested in the idea of like, yeah, why aren't those dumb artists painting history more accurately? Be cautious about your own assumptions there. And for any artists who might be watching this saying, yeah, why don't those dumb scholars just leave us alone and let us be expressive artists? There's some caution there as well that I hope that I can try to talk about for both sides. This is one thing I've written on it that I just want to read that kind of summarizes where we may be coming from about art and history. True art and true history rarely, if ever, fully combine. History and art are intertwined entities. History needs to be visually represented. And artists need meaningful history to create impactful images. But their connection more often creates difficult knots instead of well-tied bows that serve both art and history. These knots result because the aims of history and the aims of art are not aligned, often pulling in entirely different directions. History wants facts, art wants meaning. History wants to validate sources, art wants to evoke emotion. History is more substance, art is more style. History wants accuracy, art wants aesthetics. The two disciplines often love yet hate each other as they strive to serve their different masters. Now, why are they so necessary in terms of art and history? This is from a book called The Ministry of Art by Leon Alberti. He said, quote, "Painting contains a divine force which not only makes absent men present, as friendship is said to do, but moreover makes the dead seem almost alive." And that is why history wants art and needs art. They make the past come alive. And art needs and wants history because it brings to life things that people care about. So there's a problem, however, with it. In everybody's mind right now, I'd invite you to picture Jesus. Just get an image of Jesus. And probably consciously or subconsciously, even if you didn't want to, you probably had an image, something like this, pop into your head of a man with longer hair, parted down the middle, with a beard, higher cheekbones, strong facial features, in a robe. That's probably what popped into your head. That's not necessarily informed by history. That's informed by art. And I'll talk a little bit. There's a lot of discussion about right now in the art world and given current social events about why we depict Jesus the way we depict him, and should we? And this is not a new discussion, by the way. This discussion has been around for a long time. Or picture in your mind the 2,000 stripling warriors. Now, I would venture to guess that almost every one of you pictured a bunch of extremely, I think the exact scholarly term is ripped out of their mind men. You probably pictured something like Freeburg's depiction. We've almost, by the way, turned stripling into a colloquial, we changed it. We think stripling means strapping. Helaman and his 2,000 strapping warriors. Now, Freeburg said that the reason why he painted people so muscly is because it was symbolic. He wanted it to represent their spiritual strength that they had. But the irony of it is we've turned it literal. And when I say picture them, you actually picture the opposite of the word. Stripling, from 1828 Webster's Dictionary, it means a stripe or a pole. Literally a bean pole. Stripling warriors are prepubescent teenage boys, if I can say it bluntly. They are boys who haven't reached manhood. Picture your local congregation's teachers' quorum. That is 2,000 stripling warriors. Now the beauty of it is Freeburg painted such powerful images that we know the story, we remember it. But his images affect the way we interpret the story that actually takes away the miracle. If you had 2,000 guys that are built like that, by the way, you don't need God to win a war. They're going to win anyway. But when you have 2,000 teachers' quorum boys who are little bean poles and have never been to battle, suddenly you get the miracle back in the message. Or if I told you all right now who are watching to fill in the blank, in the millennial reign, the enmity of beasts will cease, and the blank shall also dwell with the Lamb. Almost every one of you filled in with lion. Why? Well, because however many Latter-day Saint congregations have this image in their foyer, right above a cheesy flowered covered sofa. And we see images like this. But that's not what the scriptures say. The scriptures actually say the wolf will dwell with the lamb. And so for being more historically accurate, we would do an image more like that, or more scripturally accurate. Well, therein lies the problem, and that's the problem, is that we often learn history and doctrine and scripture from art. And what we know something, but we don't often know where we know it from or where we got it from. This is called source amnesia. It's like trying to figure out where you and I got our height from, or our, literally, we don't know, we can't count back and trace back the meals that we ate that turned us into who we turn into. And the same thing happens in our mind. We form so many conceptions, but we can't always quite trace where they come from. This is a church historian and BYU professor Steve Harper and Elise Peterson. They said, quote, "When saints rely too heavily on visual or cinematic arts as the catalysts of their memory, the problem of source amnesia can be compounded. It is common to hear Latter-day Saints talk about and even testify of elements of LDS scripture, doctrine, or history that are suggested by artistic or cinematic representations." Let me just show you one more historical example. If I told everybody who's listening right now, tell me about the prayer at Newburgh, New York, I would highly doubt any of you can, no matter how smart you are. Maybe only a few could. And the prayer at Newburgh, New York is a prayer that George Washington wrote down. It's such a powerful prayer, by the way, that it's read every day at the laying ceremony in honor of George Washington at Mount Vernon. And yet not one of us can recite it. Not one of us even know about it. But there's an actual historical document produced by George Washington with this prayer. But if I told you to tell me about the prayer at Valley Forge, every one of you can. And the only reason why is because we have dozens and dozens and dozens of powerful paintings that are perpetuated what, by the way, the Valley Forge Commission calls nothing more than a mere myth. In the thousands of pages of letters and documented history coming out of Valley Forge, there is not one contemporary source, by the way, to validate the legend or the tradition of the prayer at Valley Forge. It comes from much later second and third hand late reminiscent sources. This happens in our teaching of church history and doctrine. One day when I was wrapping up a class at BYU, a student came to me after we had looked at historical sources on the translation of the Book of Mormon. And this sweet student came up to me and expressed her difficulty and then sent me an email about it. And she said, quote, when she learned about the stone in the hat, she dismissed it and said to herself, quote, "No, that can't be true. That's not what the illustrations of the translation look like." This time in my life turned out to be a huge trial of my faith. So I'm showing you these to show how art alters our understanding of doctrine, our understanding of history, and can even turn problematic for some people based on our depictions that we show. When John Adams learned that the famed American artist John Trumbull was going to paint an epic scene of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Adams immediately wrote Trumbull a letter. On March 8th of 1817, he said, quote, "A few questions or two." As you can see John Adams, you can almost imagine him saying this in his blunt way. "Who of your profession will undertake to paint a debate or an argument in the legislature? Here the revolution commenced. Then and there the child was born. Truth, nature, fact should be your sole guide." And then the zinger. "Let not our posterity be deluded by fictions under pretense of poetical or graphical licenses." And Trumbull listened to Adams so much that he didn't do that at all. He did not paint historical reality. He painted all the signers in one room, calmly standing there. Now we have a beautiful, and by the way, that image is so powerful, it's on the back of a $2 bill that Grandma and Grandpa give to their grandkids that they immediately spend. But we didn't get history. We got Trumbull's painting that preserves the idea of it, but not the literal nature of it. So sometimes for those who lean in the scholarly camp, these are the frustrations. They say we need accurate visuals because truth, facts, and history should be our sole guide. That's what scholars do, right? That's what artists should do as well. Because we're leaning on these. We lean on them. Scholars say, hey, I recognize that there are things that we don't know. I hear that sometimes in the discussions on how we depict Jesus, for example. Well, we just don't know what he looks like, as though that gets away from painting anything we may actually know from the time period. And so scholars say we should try to depict what we do know. Scholars say, hey, if you redepict something and put it in a different scene or way or context, it changes meaning because context gives meaning. We know that as scholars. When I was talking with a friend who's been watching the really successful video series called The Chosen about Jesus, one of my BYU colleagues just was upset and almost pulling his hair out. He says, Jesus was not with Nicodemus in Capernaum. Why when they did that series, did they put Nicodemus with Jesus, depicting John 3 in Capernaum? And he talked to me about how that changes the story. So for scholars, we say intellectual honesty means that we don't change facts and data and results to fit an agenda or a message or propaganda. That's why we get frustrated sometimes when we feel like artists are participating in intentional or often unintentional revisionist history. From just a simply theological perspective, I would add this one. Remember that truth is a knowledge of things as they are, and as they were, and as they are to come, not as we wished they were or wanted them to be. So there's some scholarly perspective. As another colleague said to me one time, when are artists going to take responsibility for the falsehoods they perpetuate under the guise of artistic expression? Those are his words, not mine. But I want you to understand the frustration of where some scholars come from and some consumers of art. And I think that's a valid question, but I also think it's a slightly uninformed question, if I can be blunt. And it's a slightly ignorant approach to art. I've spoke for the first 10, 15 minutes here from the side of my personality that's a scholar and a teacher. Now I'm going to speak a little bit from the side of me that is an artist and a painter as well. And by the way, let me just say up front, I can't, oh sorry, can I go back one slide? Yeah. I can't say why. I'm not going to try to pretend to speak for every artist out there. They need to speak for themselves. I don't know why every artist depicts scenes the way they depict them. I can't speak for the art that various entities within the church uses. But I do hope that I can share some things that might help us temper some of those frustrations or understand it a little bit better. First of all, understand this. Complete historical accuracy in art is an impossible, and I'm going to say this bluntly, even in fact an undesirable artistic ideal. Most often we don't know certain things, and unless we're perfectly recreating a photo, some artistic license is almost always taken when a painting is created. This could apply to film as well. So let's do a little exercise together. Let's paint one of the most oft-depicted scenes in the Restoration. Something that has 9 contemporary accounts, 4 that were first-hand from Joseph Smith himself, and 5 that are second-hand. We can go right on the Joseph Smith papers and look at the documents themselves. Let's be great historians. And now let's create a painting of the first vision together. I even took this photograph for you. I went to the Smith farm in the early spring and on a beautiful, sunny, clear day. So I've already given you the background for your painting. You're welcome. Well, what do we know if we're going to do a painting of the first vision, one that we've never done before? Well, we know that Joseph was sometime 14 to 15 years old, depending on the source you want to consult. We know that Joseph says it was in the early spring on a beautiful, clear morning, so we should depict it that way, right? It was in the woods near his home, where he left his axe, is what he says in one of the accounts. We know that he knelt down and prayed. We know that a dark force attacked him. He says in one account from behind. He says that he thought he was going to be destroyed or that he couldn't speak in another account. We know that he saw God and Jesus. 3 accounts, by the way, suggest that they were not at the exact same time, FYI. One being appeared, and then shortly thereafter, another being appeared and came to the side of the first. And also in the 1835 account, Joseph says he saw many angels, and that when he came to, he was lying on his back. So there's some good, solid historical data for us. So now we're going to go pick up our paintbrush, my fellow artists out there, and now we're going to start to paint the scene. Some questions, though. Is that where it happened for sure? We know it's in the woods near his home. Are we absolutely confident that he went behind the home where we typically take the first vision trails? Was it over on the other side of the farm, where the temple is right now? Was it another grove nearby? Do you know what the grove looked like? What are the trees looking like at that time? How did Joseph pose? Right now in your mind you can almost all picture a pose, but that's because you are recycling past artistic expressions. Most often, most of you will probably do this. I'm speaking in front of bright lights and we do this pose, right? That's become the Joseph Smith First Vision symbol. By the way, if you look at the earliest artistic expressions, the Tiffany window, maybe the one that was I just forgot the name of it, but Some of the other early chapels in Salt Lake and Brigham City and Rocky Mountain Saints is the book. E.T. Harrison's images that are in there. Joseph doesn't have on a white shirt and brown pants, by the way, and he's not doing this. He almost always has his arms open. One of the earliest films has Joseph's arms reaching straight up. Is that what he did? How do you know? How are you going to pose him? You have to pose him somehow, by the way. How are you going to pose him? What was he wearing? What clothes did he put on that day? Do you have any actual data of Joseph Smith's wardrobe? Or are you just going to go off time period clothing from roughly the area? What was his hairstyle like? How did he wear it that day? My hair's twice as long right now as it was 4 months ago because of Corona. Did he wear a hat? Did he put it there? What did he look like as a 14-year-old? We can get his death mask from when he was 38. What did he look like as a boy? I look very different now than what I looked like as a teenage boy. By the way, he says that his mind was taken away from the objects with which he was surrounded. We call it the first vision. Was it a vision or a visitation? Did God come to the grove, or was Joseph taken to God? How are you going to depict that? How are you going to show that? How are you going to try to get into that? By the way, are you going to show him lying on his back as he says he was? Is he standing, kneeling? Again, in 3 of the accounts, Joseph says, I saw a pillar of fire. He crosses out fire and uses the word light. Orson Pratt said he thought that the grove would be consumed in flames. Are you going to show it as fire? Are you going to show it as soft white light, as we typically do? Why? What's your basis for that? What's your source for that decision? How about God's appearance and God's clothing? Are you going to put him in white? Does Joseph ever say God was wearing white? What does God look like? What are his facial features? What was his hair like? You starting to see the difficulties here? You start to see how many decisions have to be made to do one of the most basic historically documented scenes in the Restoration. And every decision you make has implications, by the way. Joseph in 1835 says, I saw many angels. What were those angels doing? Were they around God? Were they in the grove? Were they flying? Were they standing? Were they male? Were they female? What color was their skin? How are you going to show Satan? By the way, was it Satan? Does Joseph ever say literally, Satan attacked me? Or is that just an assumption we make? Does Satan have a body? Are you going to make him bodily? Where are you getting that from? You guys get the point. This is my image of the first vision that I painted, trying to bring better in the 9 historical accounts. You can see I made a lot of decisions that are merely artistic. I did my very best. I have studied those 9 contemporary first vision accounts literally hundreds and hundreds of times. I can quote many of them almost from memory. And yet still when I sat down, I had to make a lot of decisions. Some artistic ones, obviously some ones that match the historical record. I did show it more as a pillar of fire and not soft white light. I included many angels from the 1835 account. I put his axe in the bottom corner there. I showed Satan on the other opposite side from the axe. There's a little hint of Satan fleeing. I tried to depict the grove as it would be in early spring. Anybody who's been to upstate New York knows that the leaves don't quite shoot out until sometime in early May. I did put it in the grove. Some things that aren't historically accurate, some artistic license that I took. Well, I painted it as yellow fire. I don't know if it was yellow, but it's a cool color. It draws your eye in, which is what art is trying to do. And it creates a great sense of motion, which is what good art tries to do. I depicted the Father and the Son not side by side to try to suggest that it wasn't a simultaneous appearance. But I don't know, I put the Son on the left of the Father. I had people write me and they're like, why did you put the Son on the left of the Father? He was on the right of the Father. By the way, none of the sources say that. But I wanted to try to get it almost like the Father was done speaking to Joseph, now he's turning to talk to Joseph. I chose to ignore Alexander Nybar, who says that in his account that God had light complexion and blue eyes. I painted God and Jesus a little bit more bronzed, darker toned in their skin colors. You can see a noticeable difference between them and Joseph. Because I wanted them to appeal broader to the God of humanity, which most people on earth are people of color. I purposely painted angels, male and female. I don't know that. But I wanted women in the grove. That's an artistic expression. I painted them representing different races and nationalities, trying to connect to the broader international church and its message. And I painted Satan in the corner. I made him nude, strategically in an LDS style, with his bottom half covered with a dark pillar. But does Satan have a spirit body? I assume so. Section 130 says all spirit is matter. But I put him without clothing, as clothing is often symbolic of clothed with robes of righteousness. These are all just the little decisions that I had to make. So to get to the point, this is what Arnold Freiberg said. Quote, "There's no tube of paint that says don't know." I wish I could get a hold of that tube of paint, by the way. I have to come to grips with it. You have to decide, and in context, he was talking about the Book of Mormon paintings and the Liahona. You have to decide if the Liahona is going to be this big. Now, I don't know any more than the next person, but I have to paint something. Remember that art speaks a different language than history. Art is trying to express, provoke, inspire. It's not merely meant to be decorative. Art is at its very, very best when it causes interaction, reflection, emotion, provocation even, and communication in levels that words cannot do and documents cannot do. To communicate in art, artists use certain principles and elements of design. They don't use words and grammar and comma and punctuation and rhetorical devices and logical syllogisms. They don't use multiple sources and contemporary accounts. They use things like line and shape, form, color, texture, space, value, pattern, contrast, emphasis, balance, proportion, scale, harmony, movement. Those are the kind of things when you read a piece of art, you have to read using that language, not the language of literalism and the language of direct historical representation. Let me just show you one more example. This is a painting that I did of the washing of the feet in the School of the Prophets in the winter of 1833 when Joseph started. We don't have any imagery of this, and I wanted to do an image. Well, historically accurate. What did I do? Well, I took a photograph literally from the Newell K. Whitney store. Anybody who's been there knows that red of that interior room and how it's shaped. I looked at who was there. I know that Joseph Smith Sr. was there, and William Smith was there, and Oliver Cowdery was there, and Joseph girded himself and washed their feet. And so I tried to represent that, but let me just show some artistic decisions that I made. I'm not only concerned with representing the scene, I want the scene to try to say something. So I made a deliberate decision to place the viewer outside of the room because I wasn't there and you weren't there. And these ceremonies that Joseph is doing with the School of the Prophets were for a pretty closed private group. But they are later, by the way, going to form some of the basic premise for later temple rituals and washings and anointings that take place in the Kirtland Temple and the broader idea of a School of the Prophets through the temple endowment. So I purposely placed the viewer outside of the room, but I left an open door saying, hey, eventually this is going to open up to everybody. That's what that's trying to say. I used the perspective lines of the floorboards. Look at those lines, and you know that in perspective, straight lines will converge to a vanishing point. And I used that to converge you and lead your eye into the room. I deliberately contrasted the red with the blue on the outside wall. There's artistic language being spoken here. Look how different the painting would be had I just painted this. I don't think it would have been as effective. It may have been just as accurate, but not as effective. And art has to be effective in the language that it employs. Or I want to do this painting in section 8 when it says that Oliver Cowdery had the gift of Aaron. As many of you know, the earliest sources say he had the gift of the rod or working with the sprout. Maybe some scholars have suggested that meant that Oliver Cowdery or maybe people in his family used divining rods. So I wanted to do a painting exploring that idea. But as you can also see, I also placed Oliver in some strategic ways. Why didn't I place him in the middle of the scene? Well, because there's this thing called the rule of thirds in art, where thirds are visually pleasing and create a sense of motion. So I placed him on the left third of the pane, to push him forward, because then your eye fills in the rest of the space. So artists have to use devices like that. There are some who operate under the assumption that the best art is always the most photorealistic art. Get away from that really primitive assumption. It's a basic assumption. That might be the goal for some artists, but it's not for most. Abstraction is sometimes desirable for many arts because then people don't confuse it with reality. This is a painting I did of the chamber of Father Whitmer, and I particularly abstracted it, the voice of God. I made God really big because God's big in my mind. How do you portray the voice of God? I don't know. I did it with this yellow coming down. You can see that I'm purposely abstracting it so that it sends a message to somebody of, hey, this isn't a photo, this is art, trying to communicate a concept. Okay, so as I conclude, by the way, one thing I will say this, there's power in symbols. Artists often use symbols, and they want to use symbols. I had somebody one time who was upset with me about the way that we showed Jesus, and this is literally on my whiteboard. I sketched this and I said, how's that speaking to you? And she said, I don't understand. And I said, that's Jesus. And she said, no, that's not. And I said, oh, yeah, it is. And she said, well, no. I said, no, that's not the symbol of Jesus. Then I sketched this quickly. That's the symbol of Jesus. Symbols have to speak to people. And they can sometimes, symbols are not historically accurate, but symbols communicate information really quick. So let me just skip ahead to the point to conclude. Yeah, I'm going to skip this idea as well. Maybe one day I can talk to you about the need for beauty in art as well. So let me get 3 things to conclude. Well, I will show this one. Is this image historically accurate? I don't know. But I know it's artistically awesome. And aren't you so glad that we have this in St. Peter's Basilica? I am too. It carries something that Scripture alone and history alone can't do, that is captured in paint. So, a few things. 3 things for those in... I'm so sorry, will you put that back up? I don't know what I just did. 3 things for those that are in that third to last slide. Thank you. 3 things for those that are in the artist camp. Sorry, I turned it off right as I was concluding. Oh no, do I need to go all the way now? Okay, you'll get there. I will say this while I'm waiting for that to come up. I will just say one thing about beauty. Often we want art to be beautiful because we associate beauty with God. And we're drawn to beautiful things. And so if we want to draw people to God, we make something beautiful, which answers one of the reasons why we portray Jesus the way we portray him. It's possible that Jesus isn't as beautiful as we make him, but sometimes artists make him beautiful out of reverence. It's possible, by the way that Jesus, I love, by the way, that Jesus sometimes is depicted as black, or that sometimes that Jesus is depicted as Asian, because sometimes we need to make Jesus beautiful in our culture to connect with our people and our way of seeing beauty. And so just remember that too when we try to get too historically accurate with things. Oh, it was almost there. Well, maybe I won't give the 3 and 3. Oh, now I can. Thank you so much. That's my fault for clicking too quickly. Number 1, for those who lean more towards the history camp, 3 suggestions. Strive to be more visually literate so that you don't see everything literally. Number 2, understand and appreciate the language and goals of art and that they're different than that of history. And that art often serves different purposes, an audience that history can't. And be grateful that it does. And third, let me give you a little homework. Try to create a religious historical scene yourself. Pick up a paintbrush before we become too critical. Make some decisions. Compose a scene. You'll develop a little bit more empathy and understanding for all the complex issues at play. For those who lean more towards the art camp, I'm not able to advance now. Can you advance it for me? Thank you. For those that lean more towards the art camp, if you're like, yeah, give it to those historians, Brother Sweat, well, let's give it to ourselves as artists too, and I'm including myself in this. Number one, realize that your images have historical, doctrinal, cultural implications. Take responsibility for that. Think about it. Remember that we are all historians and religious educators, whether we like it or not. Number two, study history. Do deep research. Then you can more informally decide what you will and won't depict and why, instead of just perpetuating things that have been done in the past. And third, if historical accuracy interferes with your artistic aims, then create work that's more abstraction and allegory, whimsical and expressive in nature. Move away from historic, realistic representation. And my last piece of advice for us all is this: don't try to completely reconcile the tension. History and art are two separate religious ties pulling in opposite directions. Their end hooks necessarily meet and link, but it's the tension between the two that gives us strength and allows the cargo of our faith to be carried or to be strapped down. It's that tension. If we tried to make them go the exact same direction, we would lose the tension necessary to carry religious cargo and payloads that neither discipline alone has the strength to secure. So God bless each of us as we try to understand these two important and needed worlds. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that inspiring talk on art and such. I know I had a conversation with one person who felt strongly that the church had lied to them because there was a picture of Joseph Smith translating the gold plates, and the gold plates were sitting next to him on the table, and he said that never happened.
Yeah.
So, and of course, my thought was, in fact, my wife even commented, "How does he know? How does he know that?" So, but I love the symbolism and things of. More can be expressed in art sometimes than is expressed just with just mere words.
Yeah, and frankly, using that very example, there are some things that work better visually and some things that don't. And as one who's represented Joseph using the hat, I've done some really ugly compositions with it. It's just not flattering. It doesn't communicate inspiration, revelation, to stick someone's face in a hat. It communicates, I had a bad lunch. So sometimes even in my own scene, you saw I didn't put his face directly in the hat because the face carries a lot of emotion and expression and communication.
That's an interesting thought. So, question, are you aware of any art that recasts scenes of early church history into the aesthetic of other cultures, like has often been done with Nativity and New Testament scenes?
Oh, I think that's wonderful. I think we're at a point, and I appreciate that question. Whether people want to acknowledge it or not, we are a baby church, we're very young, and our artistic tradition is very young. We're just now truly starting to develop an artistic tradition. And the next 100 to 200 years will really influence what is Latter-day Saint art, what's its purpose, what's its goals, how is it used. And as the church becomes more international and truly a global church, there will be a need to depict important scenes in other non-Western European styles, which are how most church artists up to this point have been trained. Yeah.
Well, it makes sense.
And by the way, there's artists who are out there who are doing things like that. But don't confuse that with art that is often used by the institutional church. The institutional church, for the most part, has stuck with very representative, realistic, didactic, Western art. But even now they're starting to use people like Jorge Coco and a few decades ago embracing Minerva Tyke art. She's trying to embrace abstraction and other styles a little bit more. And it will be interesting to see where it goes in the future.
Yeah, I remember, this was several years ago, a non-member looked at LDS art and music, and her comment after she looked at it was she was really disappointed, because she said there are so many wonderful things among the saints and so many wonderful artists, and that she was hopeful that she would see a lot more cultural representations of that. And it seems like we haven't made our own path in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
you know?
and we need to.
Yeah. So one of the challenges to even approaching the tension between history and art when it comes to depicting the Book of Mormon is not being able to pinpoint a cultural and geographic setting. What Book of Mormon art would you like to see more of?
Oh, that's a great question. I've literally heard people say we shouldn't paint any Book of Mormon scenes because we don't know where it happened. I disagree with that position. That's coming, in my opinion, from too tight of a history and literalness side. We need visual scenes to express Book of Mormon events and ideas. What my response to that would be to maybe, like I mentioned in the presentation, let's, number one, be more visually literate. Visual literacy is a skill we have to acquire so that we're not reading everything so factually literate. And then number two, let's let tradition develop of multiple ways to interpret Book of Mormon scenes, since we don't have a pinpointed geographical location or clothing aesthetic. When you allow diversity in art, it opens up more possibility so that we don't get pinpointed into saying, oh, that's, Nephi wears a headband every time.
And I get frustrated by the critics who say things like Jesus is standing on the wrong side, like as you said in your picture.
Yeah.
We need to allow more diversity and more expression.
Being reverent, I think there was wisdom in the church's decision to, when they had the 3 temple films that were developed a few years ago, to deliberately put them in different settings and clothing, emphasis, dialogue, almost to send a cue to the saints of, this image isn't the revealed doctrine and position. And that's what diversity in imagery allows us to do. So I would counter it by saying, let's put it in a bunch of different settings to open possibilities.
So I recently went to the Oakland, recently in my age is within the last year, but recently went to the Oakland Temple Open House, and I was really pleased with the number of culturally diverse works of art they have there. They've really expanded, for example, they have an African-American man blessing his son, and other works of art. They're just beautiful, beautiful works of art. Could you perhaps comment on the tensions, cautions, or challenges for artists depicting Heavenly Mother?
Oh, wow, what a wonderful question. Back to the tension of history and art, I had somebody say to me, are you going to depict Mother in heaven in a First Vision painting? I literally was asked that question. Yeah. And I said to them, do you want me to be theologically accurate, or do you want me to be historically accurate? And they gave me their answer, because none of the sources that exist, if I'm being truly historically accurate, none of the sources exist. None of them confirm that. However, theologically, that's one of the richness of our belief system. So if you're going to incorporate Mother in Heaven into any sort of a scene, then just be mindful of how you're representing it and why you're representing it the way you are. And be careful to not, just be mindful, is all I'd say. There is no one accurate way to do so, and there would be ways to depict her and even our Father in heaven in a much broader sense than sometimes we do. But I do think it's necessary. We need visual imagery of Mother in heaven, in my opinion.
is your last question.
Okay.
Have you seen the First Vision comic book Pillar of Light by Andrew Knopp and Sal Velluto? And if so, what are your thoughts on the artistic choices they made in their effort to balance historical accuracy and artistic expression?
I know that they've presented already, and I applaud them in that effort. And I think it's their skill and their approach to it. I love it. I love what they're doing with it. I applaud it 100%. I love that they've gone at it trying to research and based off what is known, but they themselves would be the first to say there are artistic choices in substance and style also. So as consumers of that, let's just be mindful of it, and I applaud their effort with it.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I know it's not often we get to be educated in areas of art and culture and such, but I think it's important. I think it opens, there's more than one way to understand something, and it opens our mind up to other avenues of learning and feeling things with the gospel.
Exactly. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much.